The story begins with a promise that sounded too good and true. A new financial frontier would free people from opaque banks and slow payments, and millions believed in that promise with fervor. But promises do not immunize platforms from human greed and regulatory reality. What followed at Binance was a collision between rapid growth and consistent rule, breaking that would echo across global finance. Binance started as an exchange built by technologists who spoke the language of code and markets. The platform offered fast trading, low fees, and a relentless global expansion that outpaced every rival for market share. Within a few short years, Binance became synonymous with crypto liquidity and innovation. Its growth was intoxicating, and it became the on-ramp millions used to enter the crypto economy. The exchange's ascent turned it into the default hub for traders, institutions, and curious newcomers alike. Liquidity attracted liquidity, and Binance's order books began to set prices across the industry. Success brought scrutiny, and with that scrutiny came uncomfortable questions about how so much value could flow through a system that prized speed over oversight. The seeds of regulatory concern were planted as volumes exploded worldwide. Exchanges like Binance exist at the intersection of custody and connection, serving as bridges between fiat currencies and crypto ledgers. These platforms are legally obligated to prevent illicit finance and to enforce your customer rules. When those controls are weak or symbolic, the exchange becomes a conduit for bad actors to translate illicit cash into digital assets. That gap between technical capability and regulatory duty would prove fatal in Binance's case. Money laundering in cryptocurrency is not mystical, and it follows patterns that investigators can unspool with persistence. Criminals use mixing, layering, and on-ramps to obscure sources, often leveraging numerous wallets and exchanges to hide trails. When a major exchange provides poor controls or turns a blind eye, those steps become simple and cheap to execute at scale. Binance's platform, critics argued, allowed that scale to happen with alarming efficiency. Binance functioned as both a highway and a toll booth for the global flow of cryptocurrency value. Large amounts of fiat entered the platform, were converted to cryptocurrencies, and then exited through an array of decentralized and centralized services. That architecture made it uniquely useful for people seeking to move money across borders without standard banking scrutiny. Law enforcement would later show that billions of dollars flowed through those channels in suspicious ways. One clear stain on Binance's record was its involvement in evading sanctions imposed on Iran. Sanctions are global legal tools that prohibit certain financial flows, and violations carry heavy consequences. Investigators traced patterns where Binance accounts and service structures were used to funnel sanctioned Iranian funds through intermediaries and third parties. Those patterns formed part of the evidence that regulators would later use to build their case. As geopolitical crises unfolded, Binance also faced accusations related to Russian oligarchs and Kremlin-linked networks seeking to evade Western restrictions. These were not theoretical vulnerabilities, but practical pathways for sanctioned actors. Blockchain analysis firms flagged flows tied to Russian addresses that had been converted and obscured through Binance-affiliated accounts. Those findings raised alarms among regulators, watching sanctions enforcement closely. Beneath the headlines were internal control failures that many compliance professionals had warned about for years. Weak your customer enforcement, inadequate transaction monitoring, and inconsistent enforcement across jurisdictions created exploitable gaps. Those gaps were compounded by a company culture that prized growth and decentralization of decision-making over centralized compliance rigor. The result was a corporate environment where risky practices could persist for too long. Regulators and prosecutors began to assemble pieces of a puzzle that crossed continents and legal systems. The United States Department of Justice took a leading role, partnering with European and Asian counterparts to pursue evidence. What started as audits and inquiries escalated into subpoenas, search warrants, and strategic litigation designed to hold the exchange accountable. The legal pressure would force revelations about the company's practices and internal discussions. Investigators relied on blockchain analytics and transactional forensics to trace suspect flows through Binance accounts and beyond. Those technical tools allowed the unspooling of complex laundering chains across wallets and services. The evidence painted a picture of routine transactions that, when aggregated, amounted to billions of dollars moving with suspicious intent. That aggregation became the backbone of the government's criminal case against the exchange. As the evidence mounted, negotiations between Binance's legal team and prosecutors intensified behind closed doors. Big cases like this often end in complex settlements that weigh corporate cooperation against criminal exposure. For Binance and its leadership, the options were stark, fight in court and risk harsher penalties, or negotiate a plea and accept accountability that would change the company forever. The calculus favored a negotiated resolution once liability became clear. Changpeng Zhao had built a public persona as a charismatic, tech-driven founder who embodied crypto's libertarian impulses. He tweeted openly, engaged directly with users, and was often the face of Binance's success story. That persona would be tested when prosecutors accused him of personal knowledge and decision making that facilitated illicit flows. The public image of a founder, disconnected from wrongdoing, collided with legal assertions of direct responsibility. In November of 2023, Changpeng Zhao pleaded guilty to charges related to willful failure to implement adequate anti-money laundering controls. The plea marked a monumental turn for the industry and for Zhao himself. Pleading guilty meant acceptance of criminal responsibility that few major exchange founders had ever publicly acknowledged. It signaled a new era where corporate leaders could be personally held accountable for systemic compliance failures. The financial penalties were likewise historic, with a combined $4.3 billion settlement that regulators described as the largest ever in this realm. The fine included criminal forfeiture, civil penalties, and disgorgement tied to illicit activity. Those numbers were designed to do more than punish. They were meant to deter and to set a new precedent for accountability in the digital asset industry. The scale of the penalty reverberated across markets almost immediately. In the fallout, Changpeng Zhao resigned as CEO, ending an era of charismatic leadership and leaving Binance to navigate uncertain waters. Leadership change was part of the settlement's practical remedies to regulatory concerns. A founder stepping down under legal pressure changed investor confidence and strategic direction, and it forced the company to rebuild credibility with regulators and customers alike. The resignation was both symbolic and operationally significant. Beyond fines and resignation, Zhao faced possible prison exposure under the terms of his guilty plea and the criminal statutes involved. Potential custodial sentences introduced a human dimension to an otherwise corporate story. Sentencing calculations would depend on cooperation, restitution, and judicial discretion, and they underscored the personal stakes for leaders who oversee platforms enabling vast financial flows. The prospect of prison reshaped how founders think about legal risk. The immediate industry impact was seismic as trust in exchanges and token markets wavered. Investors demanded stronger governance, and many institutions paused direct exposure to unregulated platforms in the wake of the settlement. Competitors scrambled to emphasize compliance and to court institutional clients that would not tolerate the reputational risk that Binance had incurred. The market reward shifted decisively toward regulated, transparent operators. Regulators around the world used Binance's case as a clarion call to strengthen enforcement and legislation for digital assets. Policy conversations that had been theoretical suddenly accelerated into concrete rulemaking and cooperation between agencies. National authorities began harmonizing AML standards for crypto, increasing data sharing, and demanding enforceable compliance programs from exchanges operating within their borders. The regulatory landscape for crypto would no longer be tolerant of lax controls. The broader question is whether innovation and accountability can coexist in a market driven by decentralization. Binance's fall suggests that unbounded growth without governance will attract legal reckoning and systemic risk. If digital finance is to mature, it must reconcile speed and privacy with oversight and public responsibility. That reconciliation will shape whether crypto becomes a durable financial ecosystem or a cautionary tale of technological hubris. For individual users, the practical lesson is simple. Custody, transparency, and regulated access matter more than platform rhetoric. Users who control private keys or transact through licensed intermediaries reduce exposure to institutional failures. For founders and executives, the message is equally clear that charisma does not substitute for compliance. Corporate cultures that undervalue controls risk catastrophic legal and reputational consequences. The Binance saga ends not with closure, but with long-term consequences for law and finance. Courts, regulators, and markets will use this case as a reference point for what level of oversight is required for exchanges. History will remember this as a moment when the digital asset industry was forced to choose between recklessness and responsibility. The aftermath will inform policy, practice, and the public's willingness to trust crypto infrastructure. Philosophical twist is that technology amplifies both human ingenuity and human vice simultaneously. Innovations do not automatically create ethical systems, and rules are social technologies required to channel innovation for public good. If this gave you a new perspective on how power, technology, and law intersect, then consider how your own financial choices fit into a larger system of accountability and trust. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.